I don't have one. And the reason being is I do so many different films and different kinds of genres and styles and periods that you can't really have a particular favorite, because it just really has to do with what's kind of behind the curtain in a film. And I think it's just a matter of, you know, each film will actually have a whole different sound palette to it. So I like instruments. I think that instruments that go with films the best are instruments that are almost like sounds that are almost deadened. So they don't really resonate a lot. They don't draw a lot of attention to themselves. In that way, it sort of like lets the film breathe a little more. You know, as soon as you get an instrument or a quality of sound that has more body to it, it brings more attention to it. So I think there's definite places for that really is called for. But for the most part, when you're, you know, as the film's moving along, you know, instruments that are very subtle in texture. So I don't really have a favorite instrument. It all just depends on how what really goes with the film. When I'm thinking about the instruments for a film, I have to watch the film and really figure out from the director and the producer what they want, for one, and kind of what I feel from the film. And it also depends on whether it's a period piece. It depends on the location. You know, even whether it's a low budget film or something that's a little more blue chip. There's a lot of factors that go into that. But, you know, it's really watching the film and getting a sense of, it almost comes to me in a color. Like I start and I'll get a sense of a certain color, and that will bring me to the instrument that I'm looking for. For example, there was a CBS special that I did. It was Discovery and CBS special on meerkats. It was called A Meerkat Family Saga. The location is Africa. So I use a kalimba and I also use a xylophone that isn't a Western scaled xylophone. It's an African scaled xylophone. So those two instruments together are ways that I've created that sound before. And probably thrown in like a Western clarinet and possibly even a Western flute at times. Pizzicato strings actually as well. I could play you an example, but I'd have to actually look around for it. But it would be fun to play that. I'd be happy to do that, you know. Color, like I would say there would be like a dark green if I'm, might be strings. It might be like almost like a synth pad to me. And I suppose everybody has their own idea of what colors and what instruments bring to it. But that would be one thing, or maybe you know, it's hard to have an example of that. Sorry, I can't really think of much in the way of an example and have it not relate to the film because it doesn't really work by itself. You can't just say like strings are green and drums are red. I mean, you could, but you could try to say that, but it doesn't really work unless there's a visual there. And the visual will sort of like, at least for me, the visual will give me the color or the tone. Like what usually happens is I will hear music, but I'm never able to recreate it. Never able to, I'm not like a Mozart, where Mozart can like pick out every note and do the whole thing. With me, it's like it always becomes something else. But I start with something that happens in my head, and then it becomes another thing. And a lot of times it's much better, and also mistakes are like one of my favorite ways of working. You might hit a key by mistake, like a half step together and in a certain register on a certain instrument. And, it'll open a whole new world, just that. And then it's like a window you can go through. I don't really use a lot of drums. Percussion a little more than drums. Drums hardly ever. Unless I'm working on something that's really action-based. Percussion a lot more, but what I do and probably what I get from being a drummer is I bring that sense of rhythm to other instruments. Like say if I'm doing an electric piano or something, or the relationship between the electric piano and the bass and how that moves together and propels each other forward is really what I've from drums and percussion I was able to bring that to the music. I usually decide what style of music to use in a score. It by looking at the film. I mean, the film will really tell you everything. It'll tell you if it, and also with working with the producer or the editor. Maybe it's a period piece, so maybe it's from a different location. Maybe the location's Russia, or maybe it's South America. Maybe it's something that happened 200 years ago, or maybe it's something that is in current day. So it really, really depends on what the film is or what the section of the film is. As films obviously can be in different sections and there could be different periods, which is really great fun, because you really get to, that's the real fun about scoring, is, you get to travel. I get to travel all these places and I never leave my studio. So my process for creating a score is, first off, I have to get the footage. I usually get a rough cut. Certainly, I mean, that's changed now because there's almost nothing, there almost is no rough cut now because the deadlines are so quick. But I would usually get a rough cut and start working with the imagery. A lot of the script would change, a lot of the images would change entirely. But the core element of the film, if you watch it long enough, is still there. So it's just a matter of flushing out then what the colors are, what the tones are, what the period of the film is, and the instrumentation. Then you start working with the instrumentation, or I start working with the instrumentation, and then it's just a matter of starting to experiment, which is really a fun process, but it's also totally maddening because there's a period of probably I've had it go as long as 3 to 4 days where I'm not really coming up with anything, but I know it's there. I know it's there, but it's really frustrating. And sometimes I get to it a lot quicker, but sometimes it takes longer. And the clock is ticking on these things. Everything has a tight deadline. The producers, the editors wanting to hear, the next piece of music, and you're going, oh, I'm working on it. But a lot of it also does have to do with you work with the producer and the editor, get their ideas on what they're thinking. The editor usually has a lot of ideas, particularly in the last, I'd say 10 years. Editors are much more hands-on with music and cues and what they want. So there's a lot of listening at the beginning. There's a lot of watching and listening to the film. There's a lot of listening to the producer and the editor. And then I seclude myself almost entirely for the process. Let's say it's 2 to 3 weeks long. I lock all the doors, turn off the phone. There's nothing else for me during that time. I usually have food delivered under the door. And, I literally lock myself up because that's the only way to get anything done. That's the only way that I can get anything done. And I live it, I sleep it, eat it, and drink it 24 hours a day until I come up with something that makes sense to me and that I'm really proud of. And that takes some time. But once I find it, it really is a process of, I almost see it as a window where something will happen, like one note, and I will get it, and then it's just a really exciting moment in creation, because then it's like the floodgates open, and then everything comes, the whole thing, and then it's just a matter of going through all the cues and really working the themes. I really actually have to not have anybody hearing a sound that I'm making in order for me to function. Like, I wouldn't be able to have the producer in the room and go, oh, and I've seen other composers do it, and they're like, it's very almost impersonal, but it's such a personal process for me. And it's almost very secretive. So it's really hard to bridge that, because, you're going to play your first cue for them. And, you've been spending, or I've been spending like the last, 3 days just on this one cue. And you get, and it's excruciating, really, because you just don't know, they go, oh, that's all wrong. That is totally like not what we had in mind at all. There's not too many times that's happened. It has happened, but but out of like, I don't know, 500 scores or something. It's not a bad average, I suppose. But it's real, because I do take it really personal. It's really something that comes out of me. It's organic. It comes out of me. And if they don't like it, or if even, it's hard for me to even take suggestions sometimes, but you have to. I mean, that's the gig. You have to. It's a service gig, so you really have to man up on that one, and show the whole thing, and do it without flinching. But it's that one's a real challenge because there's the isolation part of it, and then there's the exposure part of it. So, anytime you're in isolation, it's all private. It's like, I've got everything the way that I want it. And then as soon as I bring it over into exposure, it's like putting a big spotlight on it. And I'm going, oh, don't listen to that part. Oh, that part, And all of a sudden, I'm criticizing the whole thing. It's a really, it's a touch and go, very, interesting process that takes place where you get from that inception to all the way to the end. I probably wouldn't, just because it's enough work to produce a film and do everything that it takes, unless I was very attached to myself doing the music on top of everything else that I would be doing for the film, which would be a lot of work. And it's a lot of work to do a score, and it takes a lot of time, particularly if you want it to be good. So someone who's not really experienced with working with loops or working with samples, and I mean loops a little more so because they just are loops, and you can just let them run, and then you can add things over the top of them. It just depends on the filmmaker, because some filmmakers are talented that way. They can be talented that way, and they know what they want. So rather than try to get it out of someone else, it might behoove them to, do it themselves. I wouldn't do it that way just because I know how much work it takes, and how much work it takes to produce a film or direct it. And, you're just wearing too many hats as far as I'm concerned. And you probably won't be able to see the forest for the trees at the end of the day, because it's just too much, Or maybe you've got a vision and, you're true to it. And when you're true to it and you know exactly what you want, maybe you are skilled enough with technology to be able to pull that off. It really depends on the filmmaker, and it depends on how talented they are with that, in that realm, and how much they want to stretch themselves. I don't use acoustic instruments that much. And the reason being is the deadlines are so tight, and my library of samples that I have are just incredible. So you can't tell the difference, really. Yeah, you can control every nuance that way. With a live player, you've got to schedule him, you've got to get him in, you've got to get the mics up, you've got to get everything sounding good, the whole process, and then you have to convey what you want them to play. If it's a structured piece that I've already written, I have to write that out or print it out and give it to them. And just that process it's a lot easier for me to just do it myself. And the end product turns out, you know, you can't really tell the difference. No one can really tell the difference because the technology right now is so good, and the soundscapes that you can create. So, yeah, I mean, I have a bagpipe player that came in not too long ago, and that was an acoustic instrument. There's no good bagpipe sound that I have. No good bagpipe sample. You know, they all sound terrible. So strangely enough, I've got a bagpipe player that was my carpenter, and he's like a world-class bagpipe player. You know, and I had a piece on a show for the Discovery Channel that called for one. Besides that, hardly ever. I think the best way is to really look at a film. You know, when I get a film, I look at it, and it really has to scream for music. And I think that if, you know, if I was a filmmaker, I would approach the film as if it had no music in it whatsoever. And that way you really see what the strong points are and what the weak points are. And even if it's a strong point, it still may need music to enhance it and to bring it up to even to a further level. But a lot of music in film and television particularly is used to make up for something. You know, a scene doesn't quite come off. You know, if you check that same scene without music, you know, it's a different world. You put music in, depending on the composer, depending on the music. It's a very, you know, it brings the scene to life, or at least makes it not kind of a glaring wart, which it may have been beforehand, and that's just what they got that day. And you have to, you really, that is unfortunately part of a composer's job, is to almost like, you know, covering up and stitching, you know, behind the scenes. There's a lot of wall-to-wall music that's like that. Real live cues that have substance to them, which, you know, you just can feel it when you're watching the film, even if it's like really well acted and everything. It just, you can feel that. But I always admire filmmakers that can do films with no music in it, like you know, like Clint Eastwood. You know, did that one Western. It didn't have, I don't even think it had any music in it. It was like phenomenal. Maybe it just had like a guitar theme like 2 times in the film. If I work too closely with a director or a producer, then it's really not mine anymore. I'm really just a tool, which doesn't make me necessarily feel good. And I don't think that it gets the best result. I think other composers are better suited for that type of a role. For me, I have to dig down and get something. And I can't do that with a producer or a director who's kind of hovering over me. You know, I have to, you know, and it takes a good producer or director to really be able to give a composer the space to create, because it's really the job, you know. If they were just searching for music, you know, they could just go online, or they could go to a library and start picking out, you know, stuff that works for them. But so to answer that question, I've done both. I've worked very closely with producers and editors on films, and I've worked not so closely, and it just depends on the filmmaker and what they're comfortable with. You know, some of the people that have hired me, you know, we have a rapport, even though most of them I've never seen or met, you know, but we have a rapport. And, they'll just go, okay, Ron, just take it, just do that. Just take it away. And other ones, they have to be more in control about almost, just about every note. So it just really depends on the film, who's doing the film, the filmmaker, that kind of thing. Yeah. If I was to say something, I would say don't overuse music. Make music important in the film. Don't just use drones to get from one scene to the other, although they can be very effective too. It really does depend on the film. Again, it always comes back to that, what the film is. But I would just say think of music as another actor. Think of music as as a contributing part, not just a follower, but just an actual something that's very important in the film.